She arrived on a Sunday with 2 suitcases, a duffel bag, and a son named Tyler who was 11 years old, and who, within the first 40 minutes of being in my house, had located every boundary I had not yet explicitly stated and tested each one with the methodical efficiency of a child who had learned that boundaries exist to be negotiated rather than respected. He kicked the back of my kitchen chair exactly once. I turned and looked at him with the expression I use in budget meetings when a junior analyst has presented a number that is clearly wrong and is waiting to see if I will let it pass. He stopped. We understood each other from that moment, Tyler and I, in the specific way of people who have established the terms of their coexistence without needing to articulate them. Her name was Brenda. She was my husband's younger sister by 4 years, 33 years old, recently separated from a man named Keith, whose defining characteristics, in 12 years of peripheral observation, were a talent for being absent when presence was required, and a collection of vintage sports jerseys that had apparently been weighted more heavily than his marriage in the asset division. Brenda was not a bad person in the ways that count most. She was not cruel, not dishonest in the obvious register, not unkind to Tyler in the ways that matter. She was something that took me longer to name accurately. She was a person who had spent her entire adult life in the assumption that someone else would be managing the structural realities of her situation, and who had never been required to revise this assumption because someone always had. That someone, for the last 9 years, had been my husband, Marcus. I did not know this on the Sunday she arrived. I found out 11 months later, on a November morning, sitting at my kitchen table with my coffee, while Marcus arranged his expression into the configuration he used when he was about to say something he knew I might push back on. Slightly forward-leaning, slightly too direct, the expression of a man who has rehearsed his opening sentence. "I've been thinking about the household finances," he said. "Brenda's situation is taking longer than we expected. I think it makes sense for you to cover the bills for a while. Just temporarily. She's family. We have to take care of family." I looked at him over my coffee. I thought about the word temporarily, which had now been in continuous use in my house for 11 months and had not once produced the result it nominally described. "Okay," I said. Not because I agreed, because I had spent 15 years as a financial analyst, and I knew that the correct response to a proposal you don't yet fully understand is to gather more information before you respond to it. I said okay, and I went to work, and that evening I opened my laptop, and I began building the picture that Marcus had been hoping I would never build. What I found changed everything, and it started not with the household bills, but with a single line in our joint account statement that I had walked past 1,100 times without stopping to look at it properly. Let me tell you who I am, because this story requires that you understand what tools I brought to it. My name is Claire Donovan Webb. I am 37 years old. I have worked as a financial analyst at an investment consulting firm for 15 years, which means that I have spent 15 years doing one thing in its most fundamental form: looking at numbers and understanding what they are actually saying, as opposed to what the person presenting them would like you to believe they are saying. Numbers, in my professional experience, are the most honest things in any complex situation. People manage their narratives. Numbers manage only themselves. I am good at my job. I am the kind of good that comes from genuine aptitude refined by 15 years of daily practice, and I say this not as self-congratulation, but as relevant context, because the story I am about to tell you turns entirely on the specific skills I brought to a situation that my husband had constructed on the assumption that those skills would not be applied to his household. He knew what I did for a living. He had watched me do it for 12 years. He had attended firm events and client dinners, and had listened to me describe the work in sufficient detail to understand its nature. And still, he sat across from me at the breakfast table and proposed a financial restructuring of our household as if I were the kind of person who would nod and adjust her direct deposit without reading the fine print. I have thought about this many times since, about what it means when someone who knows you well underestimates you anyway. I have concluded that it is not really about underestimation. That is too generous a framing. It is about convenience. It is much more convenient to proceed as if the person across from you is not going to look closely, and so that is what Marcus chose to believe, and that choice was the central structural error of everything that followed. Marcus and I had met at a mutual friend's dinner party 14 years ago, when I was 23 and he was 26, and we were both at the beginning of our careers and the beginning of our adult understanding of what we wanted from a life. He was warm then, in a way I had trusted, genuinely curious about other people, generous with his time, funny in the dry specific way that I find more attractive than almost anything else. We dated for 2 years and married in the 3rd year and spent the first several years of our marriage in the particular happiness of 2 people who have chosen well and know it. The first crack, looking back with the retrospective clarity that hindsight provides, was not dramatic. It was barely visible. It was the way Marcus handled money, not recklessly, not dishonestly in any obvious register, but with a preference for opacity that I had always chalked up to different financial styles. He managed the investment side. I managed the day-to-day. This division had seemed sensible when we established it, and had calcified over the years into something that resembled trust, but was actually, I now understood, a structural arrangement that suited him better than it suited me. He controlled what I couldn't see. I managed what was in front of me. And what was in front of me? The household accounts, the bills, the grocery expenditures, the day-to-day texture of our financial life was unremarkable enough that I had no reason to look beyond it. Until Brenda arrived. And then, 11 months later, until Marcus sat down with his rehearsed expression and said the words that made me look. The household expenses, documented from our joint checking account going back 14 months, told the first part of the story with the clean objectivity that numbers always provide. I built the spreadsheet on a Tuesday evening while Marcus was watching television in the other room, and Brenda was in the guest room, and Tyler was doing homework at the kitchen table, occasionally asking me questions about fractions that I answered on autopilot while running calculations in a separate window. Before Brenda, average monthly household expenditure of $4,200, split roughly equally between my contributions and Marcus's through our joint account deposits. After Brenda, average monthly expenditure of $6,300. The additional $2,100 per month was entirely attributable to 2 people who were contributing 0 to the household financially. Over 11 months, $23,100 in additional cost. I added this to a tab I labeled Household Impact and formatted it with conditional formatting because I find that color helps patterns become visible, and I needed patterns to be visible. Then I moved to the second tab, which I was already thinking of as the more interesting one. The joint account statements, pulled from the bank portal in their entirety going back to the beginning of our marriage, which the bank kept on file for 7 years, and which I had access to through our shared login and had simply never examined with this level of attention, contained, once I began looking for them, 14 transfers over a 27-month period that did not correspond to any expense I could identify. Not 14 suspicious transfers. 14 transfers that were structured, at first glance, to not be suspicious. They appeared as bill payments. They had specific payee names, not generic, not obviously false, but specific in the way that something specifically designed to pass a casual review is specific. If you looked at any one of them in isolation, on any given month's statement, it would have resolved into the background of a normal household's financial activity without drawing attention. The amounts ranged from $800 to $2,300. No 2 were the same. The intervals between them were irregular, sometimes 6 weeks apart, sometimes 10, twice within the same month. Irregular timing is a technique. Irregular amounts are a technique. Regular transfers of regular amounts are what automated fraud detection looks for. These had been structured by someone who knew what automated fraud detection looks for. I know this because I know what automated fraud detection looks for. I cross-referenced every payee name against our known recurring expenses. None matched. I searched each payee name individually online. 3 returned no results at all, which is not something that happens with legitimate businesses in 2024. Every legitimate business has at least a state registration record, a Google footprint, something. 4 returned results for generic-sounding companies that had websites of the specific kind that exist to provide a surface layer of legitimacy without any verifiable underlying substance. 7 appeared when I traced the routing numbers associated with the transfers to be payments to the same underlying destination account, routed through different intermediary descriptions. Total across all 14 transfers, $21,400. I sat at the kitchen table at 11:45 at night with Tyler long since asleep, and Brenda's light visible under the guest room door, and Marcus's television audible from the living room, and I looked at my screen and thought about what I was actually looking at. I saved the spreadsheet to my personal cloud drive behind a password Marcus did not know. I labeled the file with a name that would mean nothing to anyone looking at my file list. I closed the laptop and went to wash my face and thought, with the particular calm of someone who has identified the load-bearing problem and knows what the next step is. I need Janet. Janet Marsh had been my closest friend since we were in graduate school together, in the same cohort, in adjacent programs. Me in finance, her in law. We had been each other's first call for 15 years in the way that some friendships establish themselves early and hold that position without effort. She was now a family law attorney with 12 years of practice, a precise and unsentimental legal mind, and the specific quality of honesty that makes her valuable in exactly the situations where you most want someone to tell you what you want to hear, but need someone to tell you what is actually true. I called her at 7 the next morning from my car in the driveway before work. I told her what I had found. I told her about the breakfast conversation. I told her about the spreadsheet with its tabs. I told her about the 14 transfers and the routing number convergence. Janet was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I'm going to give you a name. Susan Reeves. She's a forensic accountant, 3rd floor of the Meridian building downtown. I've worked with her 3 times, and she's the best I know. Call her today." "I will," I said. "But I want to know what you think first." "What I think," Janet said, "is that what you've described sounds like someone who has been running a parallel financial operation within your marriage and has now reached a point where the cost of maintaining it has become inconvenient and has proposed transferring that cost to you in a way that was intended to be accepted without scrutiny." "The Brenda support," I said. "It would be consistent," she said. "If Marcus has been supporting Brenda financially for an extended period from accounts you aren't aware of, and if those accounts are feeling the strain, then asking you to cover the household costs would free up the joint account for continued transfers without triggering the kind of increase in household expenditure that might prompt questions." I sat in the driveway and looked at the front of my house. The house we had bought together 6 years ago, jointly titled, which I had loved on sight and which I still loved with the specific, uncomplicated affection you feel for a place that fits you correctly. "How long do I wait?" I asked. "Until Susan has a full picture," Janet said. "Don't change anything. Don't adjust any accounts. Don't say anything to Marcus. Act completely normally." "How long?" 2 weeks, maybe 3. I went to work. I worked all day with the focused efficiency of someone who has a separate, important task running in a background process and is managing both simultaneously. I came home and made dinner for 4 and listened to Brenda describe a phone interview she'd had and helped Tyler with a history project and watched Marcus watch television and went to bed and lay awake for a while thinking about routing numbers. Susan Reeves was a compact woman in her late 50s with silver-streaked hair and an office that was organized with the specific precision of someone who has spent decades working with documents that must be found instantly and never misfiled. She reviewed everything I brought her: the joint account statements, my personal account records, the corporate registration searches I had run on the payee names, the spreadsheet with its 4 tabs, over the course of 3 weeks. At the end of 3 weeks, she called me into her office on a Tuesday morning and laid out what she had found in a summary document that was organized by finding, evidence, and implication, in that order, because Susan Reeves believed that documentation should be self-explanatory, and she had built her career on documents that were exactly that. The 14 transfers from the joint account had been routed, through the intermediary descriptions, to a single underlying account. A personal checking account in Marcus Andrew Webb's name at a regional bank we had no other relationship with. This account had been opened 9 years ago, 3 years into our marriage. It had been receiving the joint account transfers for 27 months. Current documented balance, $47,000. There had also been withdrawals from this account over the same period. Susan had traced the destination of most of these withdrawals to a secondary account whose registered holder she had confirmed through bank routing documentation. The secondary account was registered to Brenda Ann Webb. Total transferred to Brenda's account from Marcus's undisclosed account, over 9 years, $89,000. I sat across from Susan Reeves and read this number. $89,000. Over 9 years. Before she moved into my guest room, while she moved into my guest room, and if Marcus had gotten what he'd asked for at the breakfast table, continuing after the cost of her presence had been transferred to me. He's been her primary financial support for 9 years, I said. That's what the documented transfers indicate, Susan said. Since approximately 3 years after your marriage. The transfers predating the joint account withdrawals were sourced from a separate account I've identified, but not yet fully documented. It appears to predate the marriage. He had an account before the marriage that he continued using. That's consistent with what I've found so far. I thought about 9 years of quarterly investment summaries shown to me on a laptop screen. Marcus's voice, measured and informative, describing the state of our financial life. Me, asking a question or two, accepting the report, going back to whatever I had been doing. The summary reports he showed me, I said, were selectively constructed, Susan said, with the careful precision of a woman who documents facts and does not embellish them. The investment portfolio values he reported to you were accurate for the assets he showed you. They did not reflect the assets he did not show you. How much total? She turned to the second page of her summary. The total undisclosed asset picture, including the hidden checking account, the premarital account whose documentation she had partially assembled, and the traced withdrawals whose ultimate investment destination she had identified through a brokerage account in Marcus's name, approximately $214,000. I looked at this number for a long time. $214,000. Held in accounts I had not known existed over the course of 12 years of marriage, by a man who had sat across from me at a breakfast table and suggested that I cover the household bills to help out his sister. When can we have the complete picture? I asked. Another week for the premarital account documentation, Susan said. Everything else is complete. Then we wait 1 more week, I said, and then I called Janet. The week felt longer than a week. I managed it the way I had managed the previous 3, with the professional discipline of someone who has learned to separate what they are feeling from what they are doing, to give full attention to the task in front of them while the background process continues running. I worked. I managed a complex restructuring analysis for a client whose portfolio had underperformed and who needed a clear picture of why, which I found grimly appropriate. I came home, I made dinner. I listened to Brenda, who had started a new job, a real one this time, at an insurance company 20 minutes away, which she had taken after 6 weeks of resistance with the specific resignation of someone who has run out of reasons to delay the inevitable. Tyler had joined a soccer team. I went to his first game on a Saturday morning because Marcus was out of town for work, and Brenda asked if I could take him, and I said yes, because Tyler had stopped testing boundaries and had become, in the way that children sometimes do, genuinely good company when you gave him enough structure to relax into. He scored a goal. He looked over at me from the field with an expression of pure, uncomplicated triumph, and I gave him the thumbs up and thought, none of this is his fault. The complete picture arrived from Susan Reeves on a Thursday. I read it on Friday morning. I called Janet from the parking garage at noon. She listened to the full summary. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment and then said, $214,000. Yes, over 12 years. 9 documented, possibly longer. And he asked you to cover the household bills. He said temporarily. Another pause. Then Janet said, with the dry precision of someone who has heard many things in 20 years of family law, and has learned to compress her reactions into a single syllable. Right, okay, I'm filing Monday. Marcus was served on a Monday afternoon at his office. His assistant called me 20 minutes after the process server left the building. Not Marcus, his assistant, which told me something about his initial reaction that the subsequent phone calls confirmed. He called 3 times in the next 2 hours. I let all 3 go to voicemail. His messages progressed from measured to urgent, to something that was trying to sound measured, but had lost the ability to maintain it. I called him back at 4:30 from the parking garage. I had discovered that the parking garage had good acoustics for difficult conversations, and I had begun using it with the deliberate consistency of a location that had proven its utility. He said it was more complicated than it looked. I told him I was familiar with complexity, and that Susan Reeves's summary document had done an effective job of making the complicated picture legible. He said Brenda had needed help, and he hadn't known how to tell me. I said I understood that he hadn't known how to tell me, and that I had spent several weeks understanding why he hadn't known how to tell me, and that what I had concluded was that the reason he hadn't told me was not that he lacked the words, but that telling me would have required stopping, and he had not wanted to stop. And so instead, he had built a parallel financial architecture within our marriage and maintained it for 9 years, and then, when the cost of maintaining it had become inconvenient, had sat down at the breakfast table and asked me to absorb that cost. He was quiet for a long moment. The house, he said. Janet will be in contact with your attorney about the house, I said. I want you to arrange to be somewhere else by Friday. Claire. By Friday, Marcus. He was gone by Thursday. He left a note on the kitchen counter that said, I'm sorry things came to this, which I read once and then placed in the recycling bin because it was a sentence that described an outcome as if it had happened independently of any choices, and I have never had patience for that grammatical construction. Brenda was a separate conversation, conducted 2 days after Marcus left. I sat down with her at the kitchen table on a Tuesday evening with Tyler in bed and the house quiet around us, and I told her, with the directness I had decided was the only mode appropriate for this conversation, what I had found and what was happening. She listened. Her face went through several expressions. Surprise first, then something that might have been genuine shock, then a rearrangement into something more guarded and calculating. I watched this rearrangement and noted it. She said she hadn't known where the money was coming from. I looked at her for a long moment. I had spent a great deal of time over the previous weeks thinking about what Brenda knew and didn't know, and I had reached a conclusion that I held without particular anger, that the specific kind of not knowing that Brenda practiced was the not knowing of someone who had learned that asking certain questions produced answers that would require action, and who had therefore developed a practiced incuriosity about those questions. This was not the same as not knowing, but it also was not the same as knowing. It existed in the gray space between those two things, and I had decided that the gray space was not my problem to resolve. You have 2 weeks, I said. I'll help you find a short-term rental if you need assistance. She said, after everything we've been through. I said, after everything is a phrase that requires both people at the table to agree on what everything was. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she got up from the table and went to the guest room, and I heard her on the phone within 3 minutes, which told me that the network of people who might help her had been maintained and available all along. She moved out on a Saturday, 6 days later, to a furnished apartment that a college friend of hers had arranged. Tyler shook my hand when they left, which surprised me and which I respected. I told him he was a good kid and meant it. He said thanks and carried his own bag to the car, which was a thing he had not done when he arrived 11 months ago. I stood on the porch and watched them drive away and felt something I did not immediately have a name for. Not relief, exactly, though relief was part of it. More like the specific sensation of a structure that has been asked to hold an incorrect load for a long time and has now been returned to its correct configuration. The legal proceedings lasted 6 months. I want to be honest about those 6 months in a way that the summary version of this kind of story typically isn't. They were hard. Not in the dramatic way of stories that have scenes and confrontations and moments of obvious crisis, but in the sustained, grinding way of a legal process that moves at its own pace and requires your constant, careful attention while the rest of your life continues around it. I worked. I managed my portfolio of client accounts with the same precision I always had, because the work was honest and required honesty from me, and I found that I needed that. I ran in the mornings, which I had stopped doing when Brenda arrived, because the mornings had become crowded with other people's needs, and I had let my own recede. I reclaimed the mornings the week Marcus left, and I did not relinquish them. Susan Reeves's documentation was complete by the end of the second month. The complete picture: $231,000 in undisclosed assets, including the premarital account whose full history she had now assembled. The joint account transfers: $21,400 of marital funds redirected over 27 months. The total support provided to Brenda over 9 years, $92,000 in final accounting. Marcus's attorney made several attempts at framing the premarital account as a protected premarital asset. Susan's documentation, which was organized with the specific precision of someone who had anticipated these framing attempts and had prepared evidence for each one, addressed these arguments methodically. The joint account transfers, $21,400 of marital money, were not addressable by any premarital framing because the transfers had occurred within the marriage from marital funds without my knowledge or consent. The house was jointly titled. Its division in the settlement was subject to the equitable distribution laws of our state, which take into account, among other factors, the economic circumstances of each party and any dissipation of marital assets. Susan's documentation of the transfers provided a clear basis for the dissipation argument. Janet made this argument with the particular precision of someone who has made it before and knows exactly how to make it legible to a mediator. The settlement was finalized on a Tuesday in March. I read the final document at Janet's conference table and signed it with the pen she handed me, and thought about Marcus at the breakfast table with his rehearsed expression and his horizontal hand gesture and his word temporarily. Temporarily had lasted 11 months and cost, in documented marital asset dissipation alone, $21,400. The settlement, which reflected the complete undisclosed asset picture, was significantly more than that. Janet described it as proportionate, which in her vocabulary is the highest commendation available. I went home on a Tuesday afternoon in March through a city that was doing what cities do in early spring: tentative, recalibrating, the first actual warmth of the year arriving in specific patches of sunlight between buildings. I parked in my driveway. I sat in the car for a moment and looked at the house. The house that was now mine, in the uncomplicated, complete sense of a thing that belongs to you without qualification or complication. I went inside. The house was exactly as I had left it that morning: clean, organized according to my preferences, which I had been quietly reclaiming room by room since November. The kitchen, the way I preferred it. The guest room returned to its original purpose, which was to hold suitcases rather than people who had arrived temporarily and stayed for 11 months. My good towels on the correct shelf. I made coffee. I sat at the kitchen table and opened my laptop and found the spreadsheet I had built on that first Tuesday evening. The spreadsheet with its tabs, each one constructed in the patient, specific way of someone who had learned from the best teacher she had ever had that the most powerful thing you can bring to any complex situation is a clear and complete picture of what is actually happening. I added a fifth tab. I looked at it for a moment, the clean, empty grid of it, and thought about what to put in it. Then I typed, in the first cell, current net position, post-settlement, and I entered the number below it. I looked at the number for a moment. It was specific. It was documented. It was entirely accurate. It was mine. I closed the laptop. Outside the kitchen window, the afternoon light was doing its early spring thing. Specific and clean, coming in at the angle it only comes in at in March and April, the angle that makes everything it touches look exactly as it is, rather than better or worse. I drank my coffee. I thought about Tyler scoring a goal on a wet October morning and looking over at me from the field with his uncomplicated 11-year-old triumph. I thought about Janet answering the phone at 7 in the morning and saying Susan Reeves without hesitation. I thought about Susan Reeves's summary document, 16 pages of numbers that told the truth, because numbers always tell the truth if you read them correctly. I thought about the breakfast table, the expression Marcus had arranged, the word temporarily. I thought, I read them correctly. My phone was on the table. I picked it up and texted Janet. "It's done. Thank you." She replied within a minute. A single word, "Good," which from Janet is a complete sentence and means exactly what it says. I put the phone down. I finished my coffee. I got up and rinsed the mug and set it in the drying rack and stood at the kitchen window and looked at the backyard, which needed attention. The early spring kind, the turning and the clearing, and the beginning of the patient work that produces, eventually, something that grows. My father had taught me to garden. He had been a methodical man who believed in reading the ground before you did anything to it, in understanding what was actually there before you imposed what you wanted to grow. He said the garden will tell you what it needs if you pay attention. He said this about gardens, and he meant it about most things. I had paid attention. The ground was mine. Spring was here. Things would grow. I went to find the gardening gloves.